Hi everyone, welcome to this video on the final project. This is a video in which I'll talk a little bit about what I'm expecting from your final project. I'll give you a couple of ideas as well on how to do it, or the kinds of questions you might be able to ask. And we'll look shortly at the Jupyter Notebook template that I'm giving you in order to submit your final project. So without further ado, let's get to it. These are the details. So you will submit your final project as a Jupyter Notebook, which is to be found in the class GitHub repo. And you will zip that notebook, including the two folders that go with it, as a zip file. You will then upload that to bCourses. So you don't write a separate essay. Everything should be within that single Jupyter Notebook, including your references, the images you want to use, and of course any code cells with the analysis. So keep in mind that you can write a typical essay, including an introduction, in which you sort of set out why you're interested in a particular subreddit, a body in which you give a couple of arguments and a conclusion. But you can also write a more practical essay where you develop a kind of approach or a method or an application based on some of the tools or a combination of the tools that you've been learning about. For instance, if you want to create, a method to explore language biases in a very particular community you're interested in, using, for instance, different target concepts. So based on that week 4 word embeddings approach we did, then that's something you could do. Yeah, the length of your essay should be between 2,500 and 3,000 words. That is excluding code and excluding references. Again, if your text is a lot longer or shorter, that will impact the grade. And you can find more info on the bCourse assignment page, which I think you're probably already on right now. So if you want to do critical digital humanities, what does that look like? Well, a couple of things to keep in mind, and I hope these are now a bit familiar to you after doing this course, right? The first one is, instead of viewing language as something that represents or mirrors reality, work from the assumption that it always constructs reality. In relation to which you can then adopt a certain attitude as the researcher. So think about the ways in which language within the community of your interest is creating a particular worldview, is creating a particular reality for the people within that group, right? This is obviously important as we are doing natural language processing. We are looking at language and we are interested in the ways in which language constructs reality. Next, instead of aspiring to a sort of objectivity or neutrality, be transparent about your own moral assumptions, it says here, but that should just be assumptions in general, and the goals that result from these assumptions. So you are coming into this subreddit, you are coming into this community with particular ideas about, what it is, what these people are doing. You might be part of the community already. You might very much stand directly opposed to what this community is doing. You might hate it, right? But be aware of these assumptions and how that influences the kinds of research goals you have, and make that explicit in your essay. Thirdly, instead of looking to confirm a certain hypothesis, that's not what we're interested in here, explore your research object hermeneutically. And by now this means following the hermeneutic circle. In our case, that means looking at a data set from a distance, so doing a distant reading through, topic modeling or TF-IDF or one of these things that you've learned, right? Use that method to then zoom into a particular sample that you can then close read, and that can then again help you to develop your own argument that you want to make. And then go back to distant reading, close reading, and so on and so forth. That's one. Secondly, this also means to move back and forth between what is already familiar and what is unfamiliar, or strange even, right? So that also means the data kind of talks back to you. Whatever is happening in that community is also having its influence on you and how you are interpreting things. That is to say, there might be surprises along the way. There might be ways in which you do not fully understand what this community is doing or what they're talking about. There might be ways in which you have to revise your original position. All of that kind of reflection is interesting to take with you and to make explicit in this essay. And then finally, and this is related, I guess, instead of offering conclusions and sort of distancing yourself from the topic, view it as this ongoing dialogue that doesn't have to be carried to a final point. So it's fine if at the end you still have questions, if at the end you haven't fully answered your own research question if you had one. It's fine if things are left open. Just make that explicit and show where, continuing work might be done. Next, reflection, right? By now, I hope you realize, the hermeneutic approach is all about reflecting on your own attitude and your own assumptions and ideas as a researcher. So think about the different ways in which your horizon, to use that term by Gadamer, is in relation to the horizon of the data set, the community that you're analyzing. So, for instance, how am I trying to understand the people behind the interactions I see? So how am I widening my horizons as a researcher? Or how am I already familiar with what I'm seeing in this data? Like I just said, right? Maybe you come into this research with particular assumptions about this data set or about what's going on. Think about that and allow yourself, again, to enter into a dialogue with that data set, with that community, and change those assumptions that you might have. We could call this, in Gadamer's terms, a fusion of horizons, right? And then finally, and this is about, critical thinking, about Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida and so on, how am I trying to expose the binaries and power relations in this data? So it's sort of a dissemination of horizons. We could call it deconstruction, right? We've seen that language constructs reality, and we've also seen that language always kind of escapes, right? As Derrida would put it, it's never really fully under your control. So the community you're looking at might have particular ideas about the world. They might construct a certain reality, but the words they use always kind of lead to other conclusions as well. Or the words they use might complicate their own point. Or the words they use might not be as clear as they think they are. Or there might be clear controversialities within even the subreddit about what a particular term means. All of that is interesting stuff for you to reflect on in your essay. Then, some ideas, right? These are just some things you can do. Feel free to make use of them or not make use of them. But one thing you can do is measure linguistic differences between particular groups in your community. So in our week on TF-IDF, we looked at Am I the Asshole? And we looked at the differences between people who were classified as assholes and non-assholes. And then we looked at, okay, are these two groups using different types of language? What are the most relevant terms in both of these groups using TF-IDF? You can do something like that, right, with your own data set. Maybe there are flares in your data as well that distinguish particular groups. You can also make your own groups, for instance, by offsetting the top scoring posts against the lowest scoring posts or things like that. Whenever you can create groups, you can do something like this. Secondly, you can explore popularity. Who are the most popular users, or what kinds of posts are getting upvoted the most consistently? Again, are there certain particularities to that language of those posts when compared to the others? Are there particular terms or people or features mentioned in these kinds of posts? And why, then, is of course the question. You can try and find controversial posts and comments, so those that get a lot of positive and negative feedback. Reddit also helpfully has a controversial filter that you can use once you're on the website itself. And of course, you can think about what does controversiality mean in and of itself, right? What are the terms or the ideas that aren't fully set in the discourse of this community? What are the things that this community is not in agreement about? That is interesting, especially in the context of that dissemination of horizons that we just discussed. You can do a network analysis and find the users with the most influence, or in the center of the discourse, you could say. Look at what other subreddits they are involved in. Again, we did this in the notebook on network analysis, so you can replicate that with your own data and then sort of find out, okay, what are the adjacent subreddits to the one I'm looking at, and why is that the case? Does this tell me anything about this subreddit? Things like that. And then there's some more ideas here around phrasal patterns. So for instance, you can look at how phrases like all x are y or some x are y, and then you replace x and y obviously with a bias you could be interested in. So look for all men are evil or something, and then find out if you get a lot of results, right, which will tell you something about the biases in that data set. I suppose a more robust way of doing the same thing would be through the language biases notebook that we've used in week 4, where again we looked at 2 target sets, target concepts like men and women, but it can be anything, and then see what kind of language biases exist in your data. That could be very interesting. You could, of course, also find and define your own target sets there. You don't have to use the one that we used in the example for gender. You could, for instance, look at political orientation or something like that. You'd then have to come up with 2 target sets, i.e. lists of words that that you consider representative for instance, left or right-wing politics or something like that, and then look at what the biases in your data set are vis-a-vis those concepts. You can do unsupervised categorization. We've seen this, right? Topic modeling is a good example. Run a topic model, see what it does. Actually run a few with different parameters. We've discussed this in that notebook, right? But you want to make sure that you have a robust topic model, and then you maybe find topics that are very surprising that you didn't expect to be there. Or maybe you find exactly the topics you did expect, and maybe you find that a lot of topics are very nonsensical. Whichever it may be, reflect on it. And hopefully it brings you further again in this sort of hermeneutic circle of close and distant reading. So for instance, if you find a very interesting and unexpected topic, you could use that in order to track particular posts that you then close read. And then there's sentiment analysis, right? Which posts or comments carry the highest or the lowest sentiment? Read them. Are they interesting? Are they somehow representative of this subreddit? Are they saying something about the kinds of attitudes that you've seen when analyzing this subreddit? Could be interesting. And finally, unsupervised classification. We looked at this shortly in one of the final notebooks, right? Training a naive Bayes classifier and seeing how it performs based on features in your data. That could be score or flare, but again, you can also define your own features, feature extraction as it's called, and create your own classifier if you're interested. Right, that's it. The final thing I want to do is quickly have a look at the Jupyter Notebook that you'll be using. So this is what that looks like. You'll see here in this folder we have the Jupyter Notebook that you'll be using. It's in the back here. But you also have 2 folders here, data and figures. And this is where I want you to put your data sets in data and the figures that you use. And then you point to these from within your Jupyter Notebook. So just an example, here we are loading up this CSV file, and it's in the data folder, and then this is the name of that CSV file. So again, if we just go here, then you see this is where that file lives. So that's how you point to files from within your Jupyter Notebook, and the same goes for something like a figure. Here is the example, and that's how that works. But yeah, just to start at the beginning, you will change the project title and your name here. You will set up the environment first, so all of the dependencies, all of the packages that you're using. Then you can, just add different text, markdown cells, and, write your introduction, write your essay, right? You can change these titles, of course. They don't have to be introduction, analysis, yada yada. You can decide that yourself and make it a little bit more interesting. Yeah, and that's it, really. So use these code cells to run your code, so I can replicate that and see if your code works and so on, and intersperse it with text. Write some conclusions, add your references. So finally, you'll zip all of this, these 3 things really, compress and send that zip file through bCourses. And that's it, really. So if you have further questions, let me know, and looking very much forward to reading your final projects.